a couple weeks ago, I put out a video showing how you can use a torch burnout clock in order to achieve an odd redstone tick delay. And while that is certainly true, there was one major problem with the video. This circuit right here is completely locational. As for why this is the case, we'll refer to this little diagram right here. Now obviously, the idea is we would not be using things like observers and repeaters, just torches. However, I've included them just to help demonstrate what's going on. So the idea is first we use this burnout clock in order to achieve an odd delay, as a burnout clock activates when you update it, not when you power it or depower it. So that means whether we turn a torch on or off, we'll be able to have this turn on in response to that either way. So we activate that, and it goes to power this torch. However, because that is a clock, and we want a steady pulse, we then fill in the gap with a delay. And it ends up looking something like this. This top part is the burnout clock, and this is the delayed part. And so, starting at this point, the combined torch should be powered, right? Well, kind of. You see, what ends up happening underneath the surface is once we reach this point, the tile tick is scheduled for the torch, and then once we get here, that's when the torch is going to be processed. The problem is, there could actually be a zero tick off pulse right as this is processed, and that would be caused by this being processed and this not being processed by the time this one gets ticked. Because then this will be off, this will yet to be on, and so it does not work. So the reason this ends up being locational is it all depends on what gets activated first. So, I do now have a different version that is not locational, and it uses this setup instead. So instead of having one burnout clock, we have two. And so it ends up looking like this, which seems like it would just be a lot worse. However, it's actually a bit easier to control. So basically, same idea as before, except instead of filling in the gap with a delayed signal, we're just filling it in with another clock. However, all that needs to happen now is one of three things happen. Once this torch turns on, either it needs to update that torch before this one, it needs to update this combining torch before it updates itself, or it needs to update the second clock before it updates itself. As long as one of those three things happen, it will cause the correct update order. Okay, so here's where the real problem kicks in. So all we need to do is control the update order, right? And not use parts that have locational update order, maybe? Well, good news is there's only really two parts in Redstone, two components, that have a very locational update order. The only problem is they are dust and torches, in other words, the only two components we have access to in this scenario. So what can we do? Well, without getting too much into the details of it, so that's the updates that a torch causes, and it is the same thing with redstone dust. So it updates every block within 2 blocks away. The only problem is some of that order is not very consistent. Now, there are a few things about this that are actually consistent, but one of the main ones, and the one that I used in my design, is the fact that these two spots will always get processed before this spot, no matter what, regardless of whether that block is there. Of course, this is directional, in that this is only for the east and west. This is the west, this is the east. If you go north and south, it's not necessarily reliable. So we can avoid the directionality by simply having these two blocks and making it so that as long as one of these two is updated before this one, then it works. There's, of course, the problem of how do we get that to work, and the answer is a note block, because they are created entirely from wood and redstone. But, unlike torches and dust, they only create updates immediately around them, and it's in a very consistent manner. So, this is exactly what I used. So here's the circuit. This right here is the first burnout clock. As you can see, it goes and powers these two note blocks, which, of course, it doesn't matter which one gets updated, it will always update this torch, and this is the second burnout clock. And then the two blocks above is this redstone dust, which both powers the burnout clock and the combining torch. And this does exactly what we need it to. And so the end result is that. And we can run it through with the carpet mod. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then on the 5th redstone tick, it is turned back off. One other very interesting detail is that you can actually use water to get an odd game tick delay with this, which normally is a little more tricky to do. So the fact that you can do this entirely with just wood, redstone, and water, no stone or anything required, is kind of cool. This takes advantage of the fact that water flows every 5 game ticks, which is obviously an odd number. So, if I press this button, and go forward 9 game ticks, this torch will activate, which is pretty neat, I guess. I don't know if that will ever have any actual usage, but hey, now you know. As I was working on this, I figured out that there are some locations where you actually don't need any of that update order stuff, because that works. Now, the reason that this ends up working is because whenever this torch gets processed, this torch will still be on, and that's because the order of them being processed changes on every tick. However, as you can probably imagine, this is very locational. It doesn't work here, instead we get the opposite effect, and in some cases, let's see if I get lucky. And then, of course, in some cases it works exactly the way you would expect it to, where it causes it to flash. Unfortunately, I do not plan on working on this any further. The only real use case of this, at least so far, is an AFK treasure fish farm in a skyblock world. So, I'd say that having to chop down a couple extra trees for 2 note blocks is probably fine. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. YouTube Analytics tells me that only 7.8% of the first million natural numbers are actually prime. So let's see if we can change that. If it's not too much to ask, I would also love it if you were to subscribe to 2 and H2O. And until next time,